The cold gift. Christmas was supposed to be a time for joy, for laughter and warmth shared with loved ones. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove up the icy mountain road to my grandparents' house. It had been years since I'd visited them in their small cabin nestled deep in the snowy forests of Vermont. My work and the hustle of city life always seemed to get in the way, but this year, guilt had finally caught up with me. "Come for Christmas, Olivia," Grandma had said over the phone, her voice softer than I remembered. It would mean so much to us. And so here I was, my car loaded with hastily wrapped presents and a bag of groceries, winding my way through the white, frozen wilderness. The sun was setting when I arrived, casting an orange glow over the snow-covered trees. The cabin was just as I remembered, modest and welcoming, with a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Grandma and Grandpa greeted me at the door with open arms. They looked older, more fragile, but their smiles were as warm as ever. "You made it just in time," Grandpa said, patting my shoulder. "A big storm's coming in tonight. The roads will be impassable by morning." Inside, the cabin was a haven of Christmas cheer. The tree stood in the corner, adorned with handmade ornaments and twinkling lights. The scent of pine mixed with the aroma of freshly baked cookies. For a moment, I felt at peace. But that night, something shattered the tranquility. It started with a knock at the door. I woke to the sound, disoriented in the dark. My room was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. Groggily, I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was 2:47 a.m. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. I sat up, listening. Maybe it was the wind, I thought, or the storm Grandpa had mentioned. But as I strained to hear, I realized the night was completely still. No howling wind, no creak of trees, just silence. And then a voice. "Let me in." It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I wrapped a blanket around myself and crept to the window. The snow outside was pristine, untouched, glistening under the faint moonlight. No footprints, no sign of anyone. The knock came again, louder this time. "Olivia." Hearing my name froze me in place. My heart pounded as I backed away from the window. I wanted to wake my grandparents, but something held me back, an irrational fear that if I moved, the voice would follow. Instead, I stood there, trembling, until the knocking stopped. The next morning, I decided not to mention it. Grandpa was already fussing over breakfast, and Grandma was humming Christmas carols as she wrapped gifts. Maybe I'd imagined it, I told myself. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement outside, a shadow darting between the trees, the faint crunch of snow underfoot. "Are you okay, dear?" Grandma asked as we decorated cookies by the fire. I forced a smile. "Just tired, I guess. I didn't sleep well." She gave me a knowing look. "It's the forest," she said, her voice low. "It can feel strange this time of year. Don't let it get to you." Her words did little to comfort me. That evening, after dinner, Grandpa told me an old family story. "Back when I was a boy," he began, "there was a legend in these parts about the Frost Child. They said it was a spirit that roamed the woods during winter, knocking on doors and windows, pretending to be someone you knew. If you let it in, it would take you away, and no one would ever see you again." Grandma shushed him. "Don't scare her with that nonsense, Harold." But his words stuck with me. That night, I bolted my door before going to bed. The storm had arrived in full force, the wind howling outside like a wild animal. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. And then it started again. The knock. This time, it wasn't at the door. It was at my window. "Olivia?" My blood turned to ice. The voice was louder now, clearer. It sounded almost human, almost. I didn't move, didn't breathe. "Olivia, it's me, let me in." It was my mother's voice. She had died 3 years ago in a car accident. Hearing her voice again, so familiar yet so wrong, sent tears streaming down my face. "It's cold out here, sweetheart," the voice continued, softer now. "Please let me in." I pressed my hands over my ears, willing it to stop. But the knocking grew more insistent, rattling the glass. Finally, I found the courage to look. The curtains were drawn, but through the gap, I saw something, just a glimpse. A pale face, featureless except for hollow black eyes, staring back at me. I screamed, stumbling backward. The knocking stopped. The next morning, I told my grandparents everything. I expected them to laugh or dismiss it, but they didn't. "You saw it," Grandma said, her face pale. Grandpa's jaw tightened. "We should have warned you. The Frost Child, it's real. It preys on the lonely, on those who've lost someone. It uses their grief to lure them in. Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. We thought it would leave you alone, Grandma said, tears in her eyes. It hasn't come for us in years. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Grandpa salted the doors and windows, muttering prayers under his breath. Grandma burned sage, her hands shaking. But as night fell, the fear returned. The storm had worsened, the wind screaming through the trees. The power flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. We lit candles and huddled together in the living room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. And then the knocking began. This time it was everywhere, at the front door, the windows, even the walls. Let me in. The voices came from all directions, overlapping, pleading. My mother, my best friend who had passed away years ago. Even Grandpa's voice, though he was sitting right beside me. We can't let it in, Grandpa said, gripping my hand tightly. No matter what it says. The hours dragged on, the knocking relentless. The shadows seemed to move, stretching across the walls like dark tendrils. The fire flickered and dimmed, and the air grew colder. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to silence. The storm had stopped, and the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. But something was wrong. Grandma was gone. Her chair was empty, her blanket draped over the armrest. The door was wide open, snow blowing in. Grandma, I called, my voice breaking. Grandpa and I searched the woods for hours, but there was no sign of her. Just a single set of footprints leading away from the cabin, vanishing into the trees. We never found her. Every Christmas since, I've stayed in the city, far from the snow and the forests. But every year, without fail, I hear it, just as I'm drifting off to sleep. The knock, and my grandmother's voice whispering, Olivia, let me in. The man in the red suit. Christmas has always been my favorite holiday. The lights, the music, the excitement of giving and receiving. It's the one time of year when the world feels warm, even in the coldest winter. But now, I can't think of Christmas without a chill creeping up my spine. It all started last year, when I decided to spend the holiday with my friend Clara at her family's cabin in the woods. It wasn't the traditional kind of Christmas I was used to. There would be no bustling city lights, no crowded shopping malls, and no big family dinners. Just Clara, her parents, and me, tucked away in the snowy wilderness. The drive out was peaceful. Snow blanketed the trees, and the sky was that soft gray that promises a quiet evening. Clara was excited to show me the cabin. It's been in my family for decades, she said, grinning. You'll love it. It's like something out of a Christmas card. She wasn't wrong. The cabin was beautiful, with its stone fireplace and towering tree already decorated in sparkling ornaments. Clara's parents greeted me warmly, and we spent the afternoon baking cookies and sipping hot chocolate. Everything felt perfect until night fell. It was after dinner when Clara's dad mentioned the story. People around here have a strange tradition, he said, leaning back in his chair. They call it the Sackman legend. I raised an eyebrow. The Sackman? Clara rolled her eyes. Oh, Dad, don't scare her with that old tale. But he smiled, clearly enjoying himself. It's an old story. They say a man dressed as Santa Claus roams the woods around Christmas, carrying a sack over his shoulder. But it's not full of presents. It's full of something else. Like what? I asked, half laughing but curious. No one knows, he said, his voice low. But if he catches you, he drags you into the sack, and you're never seen again. Clara groaned. It's just a silly ghost story. Don't pay any attention to him. Still, the story stuck with me. As much as I tried to laugh it off, I couldn't shake the image of a strange man in a red suit, wandering the woods with an ominous sack slung over his shoulder. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. I crept to the window and peeked out. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered yard, but there was no one there. The woods beyond the cabin were dark, their silhouettes swaying in the wind. I was about to turn away when something moved. At the edge of the trees, a figure stood. It was tall, draped in red, with a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed its face. Over its shoulder, it carried a large, bulging sack. My breath caught. Santa, I whispered, half joking to myself. The figure turned its head sharply, as if it had heard me. My blood ran cold. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The next morning, I told Clara about what I'd seen. It was probably just a hunter, she said, brushing it off. This area gets a lot of them around this time of year. But why would a hunter be dressed like Santa Claus? I asked. She shrugged. Maybe someone pulling a prank. Her dismissal didn't ease my nerves. All day, I felt on edge, like I was being watched. Whenever I glanced out the window, I half expected to see the figure standing there waiting. By evening, the tension had eased a little. Clara's parents went to bed early, leaving us to play cards by the fire. The warmth and the laughter helped, but that uneasy feeling never fully went away. Around midnight, Clara went to grab more blankets from the closet. I stayed by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps in the snow. I froze, my pulse quickening. Slowly, I turned to look out the window. He was there. The man in the red suit stood just beyond the edge of the porch, his sack slung over one shoulder. His face was still hidden, but now I could see his hands, long, pale fingers gripping the sack's rope. "Clara," I whispered, my voice shaking. She came back into the room, her arms full of blankets. "What is it?" I pointed to the window, but when she looked, the man was gone. "Emma, you're freaking yourself out over nothing," she said, though her voice had a nervous edge. But I wasn't imagining things. I knew what I'd seen. We double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before going to bed. Clara fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent my heart racing. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But then I heard it, the slow, deliberate thud of heavy boots on the wooden floor. My blood turned to ice. I reached over to shake Clara awake, but when I turned, her bed was empty. "Clara," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, heading toward the hallway. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The door to our room creaked open, and I held my breath. It wasn't Clara. The man in the red suit stood in the doorway, his sack dragging on the floor behind him. Up close, I could see that his suit wasn't made of fabric. It was rough and torn like old leather. His face was still shadowed, but I caught a glimpse of his eyes, dark and sunken, and his mouth, twisted into a grin that didn't belong to anything human. "Have you been good this year?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. He stepped into the room, his sack rustling as if something inside it was moving. "Where's Clara?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the sack, and for a brief moment, I saw what was inside. Faces. Dozens of them, their eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. I screamed and bolted for the door, shoving past him with every ounce of strength I had. He stumbled but didn't fall. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I raced for the front door, throwing it open and plunging into the freezing night. The snow was deep, slowing me down, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear him behind me, his heavy boots crunching through the snow. "Come back," he called, his voice echoing through the trees. "Don't you want your gift?" I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs gave out, collapsing against a tree. The forest was silent now, the only sound my ragged breathing. When I looked up, he was gone. I don't remember how I found my way back to the cabin. When I returned, Clara's parents were awake, their faces pale with worry. "Where's Clara?" her mother asked, but I couldn't answer. The police searched the woods for days, but they never found her. It's been a year now, and not a day goes by that I don't think about that night. Every time I see a Santa suit, my chest tightens. I don't celebrate Christmas anymore. I can't, because I know he's still out there waiting. And I don't think he'll stop until his sack is full.